Good morning. Hi, Sarah. How are you doing?
Good. How are you surviving?
I am surviving and so excited to be here because we have been waiting for this week. We've been anticipating and working our buns off to get ready for this week. And I'm excited to share with everybody. Um, we did a retreat, a board retreat earlier this year, and it was a huge hit. Um, and the more we've worked with our Thrive participants, and the more we continue to talk to executive directors and CEOs, we're hearing that that this is a really needed class and service and training, and there's some some change of thought that needs to happen in this industry. So I'm super excited that we're going to do this pre-master class this week, this Thursday. It's the week we've been working up to. Um, it's called How High Performing Nonprofits Can Organize Their Boards to Maximize Impact with 5 Simple Steps. Whew, it's a mouthful, but only 5 steps.
It's going to be harder to
So,
say than actually do.
right, right. So, anyway, I'm excited to introduce you, Sarah. This is Sarah Olivieri. She's the founder of Pivot Ground. She's worked with nonprofit organizations for years and years. Not only has she been a CEO and a director, an executive director at a couple of different nonprofits, but she's worked as a consultant for years and years, and she really is renowned in the industry as a person to go um, to learn how to make nonprofit organizations work better, to be more efficient, more, gosh, get more funding, all of the things that make a really good nonprofit work well and be a well-oiled machine. Sarah has got all these things down. So here's the part where I ask you, tell me a little bit about what we are doing this week. What are these 5 simple steps? Obviously, you can't tell us all right now. We'll have to tune in on Thursday, but give us some hints and tell us why we're doing this.
Yeah. Well, I've over the past couple of years, as I've been working with clients, mostly executive directors who are the primary kind of participant in the Thrive program, as they lead their teams and their boards through these incredible transitions. I kept hearing again and again board related issues coming up that just felt so unnecessary, right? Like, so these aren't just, boards with troubled nonprofits. These are the boards of organizations whose executive directors have chosen to work with me for a year, trying to be like the best of the best, right? So
Sure.
you can imagine if you have one of these like really committed, really focused on developing themselves executive directors, and then you're
Mhm.
seeing all sorts of board problems emerge, it starts to kind of clarify some of the issues. So, and I
Sure.
have experienced a lot of those things. I've been on boards as a staff member, as a representative, as a CEO, and then also I've just been a regular board member, committee chairs. So I know what it feels like on the other side too. And
Sure.
and I just found this issue coming up again and again and again. And executive directors are saying to me like, I want to do this thing. And I'm like, yeah, that's a really good thing you should be doing. And they're like, but my board is saying no. Like the whole team agrees it's a good idea, but my board won't let me do it. Or these,
Hmm.
or they're worried about it. Or, I remember in the middle of the pandemic, right? We had a lot of executive directors and their staffs were like working overtime like crazy because the need, rose for especially human service organizations, right? And then they have to figure out working remotely or new safety procedures. Well, during that time, on top of all that heavy load, I had multiple executive directors telling me that they spend 20% or more of their time just managing expectations of their board and
Wow.
attending board related meetings, none of
Okay.
which was actually doing or making the decisions that they needed to be doing to deal with making an impact. And
Wow.
when I see overworked executive directors who are competent and capable and trying to do the right thing, and to think that like 20% of their time is not going towards what really needs to be done, and instead is going to managing a board, which isn't really highly functional anyway,
Hmm.
kind of makes me want to cry.
Well, it seems like a really like big conundrum, right? Because as
Yeah.
the executive director, they're in charge of the outcomes, right, of their organization. Um, but if they're spending 20% of their time focusing on these tasks that maybe they shouldn't be dealing with, or I don't know, it seems like it's really a pickle for a CEO to be in.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's all that pressure, of course, right? Because they're technically the board can fire them. And so it creates this really weird power dynamic, right? And I
Sure.
actually had in the past 2 years, I had a board fire an executive director who was
Mm,
working really hard and had actually made dramatic changes. They didn't evaluate that executive director, they didn't review the strategic plan, they didn't have even a conversation about their concerns with that executive director. And they let them go basically with no good cause and no plan for replacing them. And this
wow.
nonprofit's ability to operate basically just tanked, right? The staff were just like, oh, you kind of figure it out, right? The board were all people who had day jobs. Like nobody could step in. They had no plan to hire somebody. They just made this sudden move out of misunderstanding and fear. And, you know, I love executive directors, but mostly I'm motivated by, I want organizations to be able to make the impact that
Yeah,
they're supposed to in their mission. And
right.
seeing this kind of um I want to call it gross negligence, but really it comes from a place of confusion and misunderstanding. And I started to go, how could we have boards? And there's so much like supposed guidance for boards and training for
Mhm.
boards. I mean, it's like every which way you look, someone's saying, like, learn how to be a better board member, or this is what the board's job is and this is what the executive director's job. But I started
Sure.
to think, like if we have all this information out there, why isn't it working? Like, why is this the number one issue that I hear with, prospective clients as well? I want to make changes, but I don't think I can get my board to do it. Or
Sure.
board members saying like, I want our board to be moving forward, but there's all this drama and stuff. And so I just started asking myself, why? And I was saying, it can't be this way. Like this is not rocket science.
Right.
And clearly if the prevailing advice out there isn't working, I felt
Right.
compelled to really look into it and see if I could
Sure.
create something more simple, like I did with the impact method, which is, maybe that's my new like theme of my life's work: radically simple, highly effective. Because I know that I don't want it to feel so hard, right? You shouldn't have to
Right.
like, open up your own veins and like bleed for your nonprofit in order to make an impact. That's not really making that's not going to work. I know that's not going to
Right.
work. I've seen people do that.
So, something I found, and I think that it's kind of it prevails in this industry. It's the information out there and the advice that's out there for board members and for boards and for nonprofits altogether, and how they're run. I feel like, I mean, nonprofits have been around for a long time, and ever since I've been associated with them in any way, whether I'm a donor or whether I was working with them through like a law firm, or, all of the different ways, it seems to me like there's always the same struggle. And I'm wondering if maybe this is why you dove into some history about this.
Yeah.
Um, has there It's like things have always been run the same way. Boards have always been organized the same way, and nonprofits have always been run the same way. And, it's kind of like our country and politics right now. We look back at these documents that were established hundreds of years ago, and things have changed.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's like, some of the stuff that they were thinking about hundreds of years ago if you were to try to apply that today, maybe it wouldn't work so great. But I think what you found is that we're kind of stuck in those old ways. Can you tell us a little bit
Yeah.
more about your dive into history and kind of some of the stuff you've learned?
So, as though my own 18 years of experience with myself and dozens of clients, I wasn't ready to say, like, I'm ready to advise boards because I knew that a lot of the current stuff was not working. I knew that from experience, but I wasn't comfortable creating something without really doing my homework first.
Right.
So I dove into the history of nonprofit boards, and it took me like 300 years back. I went back to, before the United States was even a country. And I found, interestingly, the history of kind of the modern nonprofit board really evolved, but the history of modern nonprofits especially in the US, really stems to the Protestants trying to establish themselves in the it was not yet to be the United States, in the, North America, and struggling with this issue that they wanted. They didn't want their leadership to be under the Church of England because the Church of England and the English government were tied together. So they were experimenting with kind of different forms of creating kind of public service type things without being a government entity. Because as soon as you were a government entity, an English government entity, you were also under that religion. And the Protestants, for all their, there's lots to say about the Protestants, but they were, kind of trying to have a separate religious thing going on. So one of the first things they did, they actually incorporated their early towns as corporations rather than governments. And at the same time, they wanted to develop leaders for their future. And they created Harvard, which is essentially kind of like the first nonprofit in the US. And so, very interestingly, I want to tell you a little bit about Harvard and then jump forward to just a couple decades ago. And then I'll maybe give you some of the meat in the middle. In our webinar on Thursday, I'm going to tell you, like, you don't have to go through, I'm not going to go through this history at all. I'm just going to tell you what you need to do. So it's going to be the whole shortcut. Basically, I'll skip to, what nonprofits are doing now is there's this list of basically 10 things that most nonprofit boards have been told are the things that they're responsible for. And let me just say that, in case you don't want to stick around for the history, basically what I found is this list of 10 things, which was basically created in the late 90s. So not that long ago compared to the 300-year history. It doesn't work. When you actually try to implement it, it's not actually clear, right? So no matter how many times I see ads for webinars and trainings, they basically just go over this same list, and it's not clear because the words are not clear. And it's not just not clear, but the majority of the things on that list just don't work. They don't even follow logic, right? Like, if you logically think through them, and I'm going to go over kind of what some of these key mistakes have been in the training, but if you logically think through them, you very quickly realize, oh, no wonder that never works, right? So come on Thursday, if you want to know exactly what those are. And most of you, I would bet right now, if you're watching, your nonprofit is doing at least 2 or 3 of these big mistakes that you've been told to do. Right. So I put the link in the chat to register for Thursday. So this list is not that old, and it wasn't really, developed out of much rigor. Interestingly, let's just jump back 300 years, back to Harvard. So Harvard had a very different system than we're using today. And I think in a lot of ways, it potentially made sense. They had 2 boards, basically. They had a board of professors who basically were like an advisory slash kind of governing board. I don't like that word, and I don't know if they would have used a word like that, but they were kind of saying, yes, this is good, no, that's bad, right? We're not going to do this, we are going to do that. And then they had a second board of funders
Okay.
that basically had visiting privileges. Like they were allowed to come around and like look at Harvard and be like, oh, yes, I'm on the board. But they had like no power whatsoever. And actually,
Okay.
early on in Harvard's history, there was like this intense legal battle because there was a president early on of Harvard who wanted to give that visiting board of donors power because he was trying to attract more donors to raise money for the school, and he knew that giving them more power, more agency as a board, would kind of attract these wealthy people who were used to having money and power
Mhm.
and say so with their money. And then the board of advisors, the kind of working board, if you will, who were all right professors at a law school, right? Basically,
Mhm.
they had such intense legal battles over whether or not to give these donors power,
Hmm.
that the courts threw up their hands and said, "We can't decide. We're not going to decide. You just have to
Oh,
figure it out on
wow.
your own." And then comes like the rest of the 300 years of history, which is basically one form or another of answering this question: should donors have
Mhm.
power over the money that they put in? And legally, originally, it was even legal for donors to own the money that they donated to a nonprofit. And then there was an evolution where they said that legally it was changed. Once a donor gives money to a nonprofit, they don't own that money anymore. It belongs to
Right.
the nonprofit. And so there are these evolutions until you get to a point that it becomes really clear that donors don't have any sort of rights to control the nonprofit.
Mm.
But at that point, that's when they should have done a reworking of how we think about boards. Because at that time, now everybody's ingrained in this thinking that board members are basically donors, wealthy
Mhm.
folks who want to have some agency over what happens with their money, right? And then
Mhm.
we get into this current dynamic, which maybe we'll go live tomorrow and talk about like why is it bad to have a board of donors.
Gotcha.
We could
Well,
do that another time because I see we're coming up on time. So there's my
well,
history in a nutshell.
yeah, it sounds like there's just, I mean, which is, I mean, it's the same kind of in politics, right? And well, in everything, in religion, there's a struggle with money, right? People giving their money and power, and who
Yeah,
has power.
yeah,
Um, but it sounds to me like there's been a history of nonprofits spending quite a bit of time dealing with this struggle and who should have power and who should say what. And it seems like they're just, if we're trying to get something done, there has to be a better way. So it
yeah,
sounds like you have some tips for us, and that's awesome. I cannot wait to see how many people join us on Thursday. And I really think that everything um, that you've looked into and the history that you brought up, it just makes total sense for us to start doing things a little differently.
yeah.
Um, and so hopefully we see a lot of that change happening. I'm really excited. Um, well, I think we're ready. I'm excited. I'd love to go live again tomorrow if you want to go live and talk a little bit more about some of this stuff
Yeah,
because I think it's really
absolutely. Let's
interesting.
let's talk about why you shouldn't build a fundraising board. And I literally saw that webinar delivered. I forget which company was promoting it just a couple months ago. It was called Why You Should Build a Fundraising Board. Well, tune in for our next live
Ah.
to hear why you shouldn't build a fundraising board. I got lots and lots to say about that off the cuff. So excellent.
Awesome. Well, thank you,
Well,
Sarah.
mhm.
Really appreciate all of your research and everything that you do to try to help nonprofit organizations. I really do think we're at this pivotal time where kind of in all things in our world, there's change needed, and it's something where people are trying to make change for the better. Um,
Yeah.
Having worked in a law firm and people suing each other for 10 years, this is super refreshing. And I'm just so glad that you're here to help everybody because I think all nonprofit leaders can learn from you. So I'm super excited about Thursday. I'll see you again live tomorrow.
Sounds
Um,
good.
yeah. So we'll talk soon. Have a
All
good
right.
day.
Bye, everybody.